Listen-only mode.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your location, and thank you for attending our webinar today. Our webinar is going to be on schedule health and killing project predictability. It's going to be presented by Daryl Townsend. Before we get started, we have a couple of housekeeping items that we'd like to give out as information. First and foremost, all of the people that are on the line will be muted. This will allow us to preserve the quality of the audio for all attendees as we are recording this webinar. If at any time, if there are any questions that you'd like to ask, there is a questions box that you can submit. Based on time permitting, we will try to answer as many questions as possible. And for everybody that is attending today and that has registered, we are going to be sending a follow-up email. In this follow-up email, it will have a copy of the presentation slides, link to the recording of the webinar, and also a Q&A log for all questions that are either submitted online or offline as well, too. We're going to get started, and we're going to turn the presentation over to Daryl Townsend.
Thanks, Dan. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you might happen to be. I'm Central Zone right now, so it's 12 noon. It's sunny and it's supposed to be close to 80 degrees today, so it doesn't get much better. I will talk about for what Dan already mentioned, the schedule health, killing project predictability. We'll just jump right into it. I know your time is valuable, so we'll just jump right in. Uh-oh. There we go. Again, Dan's already covered it, but all the calls are muted, and then we'll try to answer the questions toward the end, time permitting. If for some reason we do run out of time, go ahead and submit those questions anyway, and I will answer those questions after the fact and include those in the follow-up email. Just to start it off, just our fine print. The statements in this presentation are based on our current knowledge of the tools, should be construed as an official vendor perspective, and you'll need to make your own judgments for your own application in your unique environment. For those that may not know, Dr. McNatty, that's just a quick synopsis of who we are and what we do. Project control system, implementation, cloud-based, software training services, integration, analytics. Better to show you the next page, which actually shows the tools that we support: Oracle, Primavera, Astor Power Project, PM Web, Aries Prism, Acumen. So Acumen would include Fuse, Risk, and then internal built tool that we have is Project Status. And again, we support those in sales as well as support for training and whatever support you might need. Okay, so this was actually a presentation that's being built and will be presented next week at the AACE Region 5 symposium in the Woodlands, which is just north of Houston, right down the road from the Intercontinental Airport. So this is a precursor, I guess. So if you happen to be at that, you might see this same presentation again, or really similar. So recently, more and more schedules are poorly built, neglecting best practices, causing reduced confidence in meeting schedule dates. Key elements are defeating or overriding the intelligence of our software tools, turning a schedule into really nothing more than a cartoon and nothing resembling CPM at all. To let our scheduling tools work properly, we need to really get back to the basics and build good, logically driven schedules for project teams and ultimately for project managers and the executive team to make good business financial decisions and hopefully produce a accurate, predictable schedule. So this is kind of the agenda that I want to go through real quickly. What we currently have, how did we get here, where we headed, organizations really kind of pressing some of these issues, and then I'll talk through a little bit of the tools that can help improve the schedules. And then from the tools, I'll talk a little bit about what the tools are looking at, and then what the tools can't look at. So, going on. So what do we have currently? And this is some of, I guess, for the most part, is my own personal experience. And I've worked for the owner, I've worked for the contractor, and now working as a consultant. So I've seen kind of all sides, from the outside looking in, and then from the inside looking out. So really what we have is poor schedule health, and by that I mean the poorly built schedule with little to no logic. And then if there is logic, sometimes that logic between activities makes no sense at all. In some cases, it may have been made just to check a box, just so that activity wasn't open-ended, but it may physically make no logical sense in the chain of activities as they were to be executed. Those without logic contain many constraints, and really what that's really doing is just paralyzing the schedule software from being able to do and execute as it's designed to do. Lags being used because of incomplete activity detail. Some of my topics are my bullet items because of my risk exposure and the schedules that I must look at to do for risk workshops and risk exercises. Some of my schedule health concepts or ideas are related to some of those, which tend to bring out more of the schedule health problems. And then the lack of appropriate logic detail is defeating, masking, hiding, changing. Some combination, sometimes all of those, sometimes maybe just one. The actual critical path. So sometimes that critical path doesn't go from the data date to the end of this project. It may have gaps, or it may only contain a certain window in time, which means that your logic is broken, and you're using constraints to hold that schedule together. So continuing on what we currently have, I hear this over and over again. Management's questioning why we even maybe have a project controls team. Basically what that's doing is driving management to maintain basically their own little unofficial top drawer schedule that they could open up to, and that's actually how they're managing the project and actually using that schedule to calculate their percent complete, if you will. And I see over and over again, having worked for the several owners, large capital projects blowing past completion dates consistently, some by pretty wide margins, and in a couple specific cases I can think of, there was little or no early warning. In other words, it was announced that we were not going to make it with less than a month before it was actually supposed to be completed. And a little acronym I have picked up over the years, BCBF, bright colors, bold fonts. So basically you're producing a pretty picture. It looks pleasing, but to the untrained eye, or the person that actually could drill in, that has P6, that could look into the actual details that's holding it together, it's a disaster waiting to happen. And really what that's doing also is you little to no intelligence giving an educated completion date. So how'd we get here? So some would say there were poorly defined expectations. In other words, they might not have defined up front that they want this project, this schedule, to represent the entire scope of the job from start to finish. So they built it kind of in silos, if you will. I'm seeing this more. Most of my experience and exposure being in the Houston area is oil and gas related. So this bullet here, management has placed non-schedulers into scheduling roles to save money. I see this happen over and over again in organizations where they've decided to make budget cuts to keep the projects that are moving forward going. So they eliminate the non-schedule or the schedulers and put in a project engineer or project manager in some cases to actually run and manage P6, and they have not spent more than a few minutes in P6, so they're kind of swimming in the deep end, if you will. I mentioned this already. Management expectations not defined. This schedule is intended to represent life cycle, the entire life cycle. Couple of projects that I've been associated with where there were discrete scopes of work, and each of those contractors built their scope of work, but the owner didn't compile all of those together to create one master schedule, if you will. Another bullet, no risk assessment done on a project until a catastrophic event causes a reaction. So I've been associated with many risk assessments, some as a participant, some as the facilitator, and this happens over and over again, more so in certain sectors than others. Government agencies are required to do risk assessments, so many of the government agencies and projects don't have this issue quite the scale that some of the other organizations do. And really what the purpose of that risk assessment is to capture some of those unknowns, if you will, of things that could bite you on the project, and really you're trying to create a more realistic schedule, or at least focusing attention in areas that you maybe didn't think were going to be problem areas. And much of the schedule that we see today they're dependent on user interaction, other team members, accurate activity relationship links. Basically, these can't be developed or updated in a vacuum. And over again, I see some of these things, these behemoth schedules, because they're so large and take so long to update, that the scheduler basically closes his door in his cube, if you will, and spends his day or week updating the schedule basically on his own. So there's various reasons for why. For the poor mechanics, really that's where we're at. Inexperience. Some cases it's a lack of training or mentoring. A misdirected focus. Some get lost in the details, and some are proud in the number of activities. So is more better. And I mentioned it before, the project controls and scheduling specifically is an early area for cost cutting in the environment that we're in right now. So it's real easy to maybe cut back on project controls, maybe oversight of the contractor, maybe turn some of that project controls over to the contractor and not have a owner rep overseeing that. Do more with less. Sometimes it's seen as a less important discipline, maybe even overhead. And then those that do have a detailed schedule, maybe some detailed reporting requirements, the staff that's doing that maybe is overwhelmed. It may have had a group of 5 or 6 people in the project controls department. Now it's 1 or 2, and the reporting expectations has not been modified to take into those considerations that maybe 1 or 2 people now is doing the work of 6. Detailed schedules require a lot of maintenance. It takes a good bit of horsepower to keep those schedules up to date. And depending on the contractor and the complexity of the project, comparing and looking at the contractor schedule updates, it takes a good bit of time. If you've got 5,000 or 6,000 activities in between updates, you got to look at the added activities, deleted activities, relationship changes. This takes a little while to do. And then with the software today, the expectations are pretty high on the reporting, and they're seen as, say, what I like to say is auto magic, and they just seem to happen. But in fact, they're very time consuming, can be pretty labor intensive to get that final polished report that everybody likes to see. More reasons. Software functionality trumps best practice. There's things in the software that maybe not are suited maybe for your environment, but maybe just because it can do it, maybe it's not necessarily a good thing. The scheduling tools don't provide all the guidelines and checklists to develop that plan. You can pretty much just take off and run with something, and without any sort of internal procedures to follow or external guidelines, you're kind of in the dark, and you don't know maybe until you've after completed building the schedule that you were going the wrong direction the whole time. External risks don't often enter into conversation when you build a schedule. There are some, what some people call systemic, which are more not non-project related, specific project related risk. In other words, a company that uses SAP, there are some things that are associated with using SAP that approval cycles and those type things that are more systemic with an organization, but not necessarily a specific project. Many times those things are not thought about in building the schedule and assigning durations. And this happens more times than not, right? The schedule's built backwards with a completion date decided, and you're expected to make it fit and squeeze it into a tighter time frame that it can be executed in. So you're building the construction activities and then working backwards, and you find out you need 6 months or a year more than what you've been given, and so you start cutting durations, some by significant margins, to make it work, and so you're already fighting a losing battle. I think we already talked, or Mitch mentioned that just now, management cutting back on time required. I've seen this happen a lot of time. They push back on the durations of being too long, and they say, well, you know, how do you know that? What are you basing that duration being too long based on? Is it experience, or is it just a guess? I've seen this happen a few times. A sales team of software sold a great looking tool using sanitized data, sold management on purchasing of that software, and now management's expecting the same quality to come back. And again, as I mentioned before, the horsepower, the resources required to generate that polished report is inadequate. Schedulers have lost some of the in-the-field exposure, so many of the schedulers have never been on site. I know in the oil and gas industry that I would run into some that had never been out the site, never knew what a valve was or known what an elbow looks like, that sort of thing. Some of that's due to budget constraints, and then software improvements have driven some remote trends. In other words, you could turn a guy in the field loose with an iPad, and he can update schedule activities, and so the schedule that person himself may not ever have to put a steel-toe boot on or FRC to walk around. And then again, I mentioned it before, but the project manager could have a schedule that he's using to manage the project in his top drawer, and he's estimating his percent complete because he's given up on the minutia of everything that's gone on with the long drawn out schedule. Where we're headed, well, hopefully not down a dark road to Area 51. So I see things that are turning things around to make them better, and I'll get to some of that later slides. ultimately, we as leaders, and I say we as those experienced folks in the project controls world, we must really step up, mentor the new ones on the scene, training included. I know several companies I've been associated with, they actually have some internal training um, associated with their scheduling. I know that's also an area that's been cut because of budget constraints and that sort of thing. But it's really one of those areas that if you don't invest in it now, you're going to pay the price later. And software creation has demonstrated recognized improvement. So um, they're able to find these problems and quickly and then report on it for you. Um, it's keeping consulting firms like ours busy offering services and training software. Um, so it's a good thing and a bad thing. Good for us, I guess. Um, and I guess if you're watching this on or listening on your own phone, and I say here, look around the room, well, look around your project team and see the gray hair. And you can't see me right now, but I have no hair. So we got to figure this out before the group walks off and enjoys the Caymans. My wife is a fan of the Caymans, so she's probably going without me someday. Um, where are we headed? Again, so mature organizations recognize the importance of complete project controls, which includes cost schedule, risk assessments, regular reviews, project health, and even for the small projects. And then recently revised agency requirements point to the need for more robust standards and guidelines. So speaking to the organizations, the DCMA 14-point assessment, which has been, I don't know how long now that's been in the mix, but it's growing to, I think it's actually growing to like 200 something assessment, and 100 and some odd are actually being built right now as we speak into the Acumen Fuse tool. GAO is another organization, and then AACE, PMI both have recommended and best practices associated with those high expectations for robust and complete competent schedules. So all of the above are efforts to eliminate those things that are not allowing the schedule tools to work as designed. The tools today are very good, but only if the schedules are built correctly. Many organizations have adopted recommended practices such as those I list there, and they've used some of those as guidelines to build their own internal project-specific or company-specific detailed procedure. I've seen this several times before myself, in that the grandfathered projects end up avoiding some of those internal procedures, and they're not helping projects improve if a project's going on for multiple years. So there's a list, a partial list, or a list that at least I'm aware of tools that are in the marketplace today that could be helpful in helping you understand the schedule that you have and how healthy it is. So Acumen Fuse, Schedule Analyzer Pro, Claim Digger, still around. A tool I hadn't heard of myself, but I had seen others that have used it, Schedule Detective. And then, of course, just in the P6 tool, what I call the F9 report. So there's a log file that you can create inside using the schedule checker. If you use Primavera Risk, there is a schedule check tool inside there. And then for those that are using Saffron, there is a risk readiness schedule check. And there's probably others that I'm not aware of or haven't heard of. So, and as these tools develop and improve, it's obviously an indicator that the market's ripe for areas of improvement. So the schedule software itself, it can allow for some poor practices, um, sometimes not realized until a fire drill comes up and someone external to the scheduling team has to look at some of the details and find out that those details are just skeletons, if you will. And communication can be minimized if you're not focusing on it. So the tools today make it easier for the planner to sit inside basically his cube and not talk to a person. He can send an email, he can send a spreadsheet, and then with some of these mobile devices now, someone in the field could be using an iPad or an iPhone, updating activities, sending them progress, percent completes, and throwing it back into the schedule. And you're completely eliminating the actual voice communication. And then tools are designed to build logic, which require team input and buy-in. It's tough these days with the number of complex projects for someone to be able to actually build in, basically in a vacuum, a detailed plan on any of these projects. So building a schedule can be a large task. More important even than after the building of the schedule is the upkeep and maintenance. It can assume a large amount of time, depending on the complexity and the amount of stakeholders. I know on projects that I've worked on where I've had to go basically around the hallway and sit down with all the project engineers. It could take a good bit of time to have conversation with each of them to find out where each of their activities are. Many times the schedule gets built, and it's not until they have to update it that first time that they find out that, holy cow, this schedule that I built that I was real proud of, now it's going to be my nightmare for the next several months, updating and talking to all these people. And then what I see sometimes, the project goes off the rail. It's not necessarily poor execution, but you might have omitted or added a major piece of scope after the project started. And then sometimes that is documented poorly, and these scope changes can have great impact, and it's not until maybe post-mortem after the project's complete that you find out that had a scope been added to the schedule and actually shown what the impact was, there may have been some other decisions made, and maybe that scope would not have been added if it didn't need to be, if it caused that much of a delay in a project. So the tools that we use today have the ability to produce the most functional project plan ever conceived, but we haven't used that functionality to its full potential yet. And then I asked the question, is technology a solution or a problem in and of itself? I know some of the old school guys would tell you to go back to the stickies on the wall to build a schedule. I guess that would have been before stickies were around. So what the tools are looking at. So this is a list of what would be probably a DCMA type assessment. So it's looking at logic, missing predecessors, successors. It's looking at lags, both positive and negative. Lags are essentially hidden activities. I speak more to that in the conversations I've had around the risk workshops and the risk exercises around detailed schedules. Relationship types. So what you're trying to manage there is what types of relationships do you have? Do you have mostly finish to start? Are you having a lot of start to start and finish to finish relationships? Another one we're looking at is hard constraints. So how many hard constraints do I have in a schedule? And those hard constraints are really freezing in time, if you will, an activity from being able to move or breathe based on an activity's predecessor. So high float. So do I have a schedule that's got a lot of float in it such that I have activities that could finish 2 months, 3 months, 6 months later and not impact my finish date. Negative float, which means obviously you've got a really, really tight schedule or something that should have already been done that's now not. High duration. So early on when you're building a schedule, you might have schedules that activities that have 3 months, 6 months, 9 months duration. I could see that some more in the procurement activities that something may take 14 months to deliver. But typically the high duration activities is where you get into a high level schedule, and then those high durations end up getting stuck or remain in the schedule well past when you've actually started to add in some of that detail that you're really replacing that high duration activity. Out of sequence updates, so your broken logic, so you're starting an activity, it was intended to be a finish to start, and you started the successor activity before the predecessor finished, so you're working out of sequence. Resources, whether or not you have resources added, included in your plan. Missed tasks, so you're basically skipping work. And then it's also looking at critical path activities, and really in my mind, and what I look at is kind of that ratio of activities critical versus non-critical to try to understand that mix, just how many activities are on the critical path. And also we're looking at a critical path that does go, I mentioned before, from the data date to the last activity in the schedule. So I'll get into beyond that list. There's a number of things that these tools that we have available that can't do. And so one of those things is duration. So this is something that I deal with consistently over and over again in working a risk assessment. Is it the activity duration itself? So the duration is an estimate for a given duration based on historical information from people that know the best. Maybe it's past work. Maybe it's, you know, the last project that we worked on with the same contractor. We would expect similar durations. But there's no way to know exactly how long it takes to complete a task until after it's complete. So in other words, there's uncertainty that exists in every activity. So you want to try to, as much as possible, you want to try to account for it. Obviously, you don't want to account for, you know, the worst things that could happen if a supplier facility burned down. You wouldn't include something like that. But just normal day-to-day stuff you try to include in your duration. And I see this over and over again, is all teams are room full of optimists, and they're always willing to say it could be done faster than what we did it on the last project. Really what I do when I come in and do a risk assessment, I'm essentially a hired skeptic. In other words, I'm supposed to push them the other direction to say, give them ideas on why they think it should take longer than what they've committed themselves to. And then ultimately, if on the duration, if you knew ahead of time, you'd live in Vegas and do very well, and probably not listening to me on this call right now. So anyway, if you got it figured out, let me know. I'll go with you. And again, if some more things on the duration, things that you should consider in the factoring of your duration. So incomplete design. Are you expected to start construction before you really have a design frozen and approved? Inadequate site investigation. Over and over again, I see a lot more civil work required because they didn't do enough site investigation to find out that the soil samples in the area were poor. Unrealistic schedule or budget. back to the finish date given and working backwards. Permit requirements, depending on if you're in a certain region of the world or even a government agency, some of those permit requirements that you think should only take 30 days or 60 days, in fact, maybe it takes 6 months. Weather is always a factor. So typical rain days you would put in your schedule. Things that you would not, that you would consider maybe in a risk event would be a hurricane event, typhoon, those type things. Public relations ends up becoming sometimes a big issue. If you're going into a new area of a particular region, you must do a certain amount of public relations with the neighbors that you're going to be living and working nearby. So many times those public relation functions take much more time to develop that relationship than you would maybe put on your schedule. And then owner, partner, agency approvals, they always take longer than what you think they should, particularly if you've got maybe a silent partner on a project, but yet they still want to be able to approve things. Those things are just things that take longer. So for realistic durations, what you'd like to do anyway is to go through a risk assessment, apply those durations, uncertainties into a risk tool, and then you get what you would get at the end of that would basically be a more realistic deterministic view. You're trying to really estimate reality. You're trying to put some of that realism into your schedule. And without schedule and risk optimization, your execution is pretty unlikely. And then people will ask, well, when's the best time to adjust that schedule? Well, obviously the earlier in the process, the better. I would say it's never too late to try to do it, but obviously the later you do it, the more costly it can be, and the more eye-opening it could be, because what you may not have considered early on could really come back to get you toward the end. Another element that these tools can't look at is logic. The tools can look holistically at logic to look at open ends, but it can't with certainty decide whether an activity tied together should be related. And really, essentially, only the scheduler and the project team can determine the activity relationships and what they should be. That sequence of work could vary greatly. Depends on site layout, material deliveries, partner approvals, agency permits. There's a whole lot of things that would go into a chain or a sequence of work and how you might best be able to manage that. This is one of those areas where experience and knowledge and past experience is imperative to be able to make some of these decisions. I see over and over again a lot of activities that are tied together that have no relationship to one another other than the fact that they are logically linked. They make no logic sense as far as related at all. I had a project where the critical path went through rain gutters, and it was for a compressor shelter, and it made no sense, but because of the way the logic was built. And then is the critical path realistic and reasonable? I did a project review recently where they could spell out, and for 3 or 4 days told me very vividly what they believed and knew to be the critical path. And after interviews and talking with most of the project team, they were right. But when I looked at the schedule didn't tell me that until I started asking questions about how some of the logic was tied. And then come to find out many of the tasks that were on the critical path were not logically linked to other activities that should have been linked. They were tied to maybe a construction complete activity, months later, which didn't help put that activity on a critical path. And then in some cases, too much logic, more than needed to tell the story. So I have, lots of activities that might be tied to a construction complete milestone, which you could have 200 or 300 or 400 activities tied to it for whatever reason. And then the other owner agency approval cycles, driving activities. Sometimes those owner approvals basically shut the project down until that approval is made. Projects will not follow the schedule that you've built to the original intention, no matter how well you think it was built. You build the logic out basically day one or day two of the project. That logic's going to be built, going to be changed. So it's helpful to refresh that logic periodically. It can be very time consuming to do that, and some may say it's not very valuable, but it helps to do. Another aspect that can't process is the constraints. So it can point out those constraints, but it cannot tell you if that constraint is legitimate or not. So essentially the constraint is freezing or paralyzing logic from reacting as the software is designed. In some cases it could be the scheduler cheating the system a little bit to force the activity placement. In other cases you may not have enough other activities or enough detail to actually be able to put that activity in its logic chain or logic of events. And some constraints honestly are tied to external stakeholders, and there's legitimate reasons. So what I try to do in those cases, I say it down at the bottom of the page, is use the notes tab in P6 to describe why that constraint needs to be there. Obviously, I look at a lot of schedules that I have no historical tie with to know that for the last 6 months a particular milestone was constrained and needed to be. I just see that it's constrained and I question why. And so we need to recognize and document those. So I'll go through a little bit more about my analytics and what I look at from a schedule quality in the next few slides. Typically I use Acumen Fuse metrics to look at these. I've custom built a good set of metrics. So logic, it's ideal to have only finish to start relationships. Obviously that's not realistic, but you hope to have more finish to starts than you do others. Open ends are not good to have. They really don't tell a story. Obviously they all tie to something unless it's the last activity in the model. Open-ended activities, many times I see they actually could be critical and impactful to the project completion, but when they're left open-ended, they have no impact at all. I mentioned there one start, one finish. The exception to that I see several times is if you have multiple trains, multiple phases of a project, you could have multiple end dates, if you will, for those particular phases, in which case it's probably good to constrain each of those major finishes to actually drive a critical path backwards to understand. Otherwise you may have a year or longer afloat because of those activities finishing earlier before the overall project. Reverse logic, I don't see it very often, but every once in a while someone will use start to finish link. There are only a few things or a few times that I could think of why that would be a good thing to do. External links, I see this over and over again many times because projects are being worked in P6 and the environment, and they're tied to other activities and other schedules. That schedule is exported out, and then now I have external links to those other projects that I didn't get in the XCR file. Redundant logic. So the easiest way I describe redundant logic, it started as a high-level schedule. It was elaborated to more detail, and that summary logic with those summary bars still is in there, but it's basically irrelevant at this point. Leads and lags, I mentioned it a little bit. Lags are really just hidden activities, and it's for a fixed duration. So in other words, if you were doing a risk assessment, you can't assign a minimum, most likely a maximum duration to a lag. If there's no way around a particular lag, it's best to convert it to an activity, and then lags on a critical path invite some additional challenges just to understand how that lag may be affecting the critical path. Constraints is another one. Hard constraints, you're defeating the logic purpose. It may drive more critical than it's actually realistic. Again, I mentioned it before, but comment in the notes tab for those legitimate critical dates. Some things that I've done as I've gone through risk assessments, I actually add a duplicate activity using the same logic as the constrained and leave it unconstrained, and then I can do a report comparing those two activities to see if the constraint truly was keeping an activity to happen at a certain time, or how much it might change if it were not constrained. Float is another one. Watch for excessive float. So if it's got large number of float, then it's a trigger for lack of logic. So your lack of logic is not a good thing. Large float activities typically pose low risk exposure to the project. Low float activities could become critical with little warning, maybe no warning. And real float paths are good candidates for adding concurrent work for acceleration. And then the critical to non-critical, I mentioned this before, but so too many critical might be an indicator of redundant logic. Too few could indicate a high number of open ends. Don't ignore the non-critical ones. They could be near critical and be swing factor. In other words, they could fall back into the critical path pretty quickly. And does the critical path make sense? I mentioned it before, but rain gutters on a critical path for a compressor shelter. Not thinking that that's probably the critical path. And then are there gaps in the path between the data date and the completion date? I see many times where it actually jumps, and so there's section of critical, and then there's a whole lot of float in the middle of the schedule, and then it goes critical again. And then something else I see, closeout documents end up showing up on a critical path. While those documents are important to the project, they're definitely not important to startup of a particular train. Schedule comparison, so I'm comparing two project schedules and looking at what's changed. Logic changes, date changes, so I was looking at one, they were actually changing the actual dates of the past activities. And then calendar changes, they're adding additional work hours to the day that's different than what was originally intended. And then so with forensics, I'm using an Acumen tool for that. If the contractor knows the owner has a forensics tool, the behavior changes, and then generally that contractor is going to want to have whatever tool you're using, and he wants to run it first before he passes it off. There's also a schedule cleanse inside Acumen, so I can eliminate the characteristics that I list there: redundant logic, hard constraints, soft constraints, leads and lags, and then I can modify all or individually each of those. Basically, it eliminates all of those for leads and lags. It actually converts those to actual tasks. There's a screenshot of the actual schedule cleanse tool that we can go into at a later time if you would like. There's my Acumen Fuse metric list screenshot. And then there's a list of my typical metrics that I follow. Many of those we went through already. There we go. So this is my final slide here, and now I'll turn it back over to Dan. Schedule health isn't the sole factor, but it is a key ingredient in ensuring project success. The ability to use a schedule to accurately forecast equipment, material needs, resource requirements, and ultimately the completion of a project are key to having a successful schedule. Schedules don't build and maintain themselves, so we must make the most of the tools available to create as accurate as a plan as possible, driving toward completion. Project failures often because of a poorly planned schedule, weak execution, or omitting additional scope. And our ultimate goal is sound plan to mitigate those potentials and produce an achievable schedule. Dan.
All right, Daryl, that was a good presentation. We did have a couple of questions that were submitted during your presentation. First question that came in is, when would you suggest a risk assessment or risk quantification should take place on a project?
So where I see it typically happen is at major funding gates. So in the oil and gas sector, they do a funding gate to apply for that next phase of funding, if you will. Obviously, the sooner you can do it, the better, because what that's going to help you do is help you paint a better picture of what that schedule will look like in that project completion date. Client I just dealt with in September, they actually were pre-FID, or actually even pre-FEED. They were actually looking at trying to present to the board of directors on whether to even go forward with the project. So this was even before they've done any engineering work. They engaged a contractor and spent probably 3 months building basically a bid package that would go up to the street for bid, and they were using that information to actually do a risk assessment. So earlier the better. It's never too late to do one, but obviously if you're in construction already, you may be doing it for a fire drill to answer a question on how bad could it be kind of question, right? So obviously the sooner the better. The other thing that's to keep in mind with how early is how often. Many times I see that risk assessment happen one time, and then they put it on a shelf and they don't review it again. The risk register that includes all these risks for the overall project, that list changes. It's a live document. So over the course of a project, particularly if it's a 3 to 5 year project, that risk register is going to change. There's going to be things coming off of the list that are complete or in the past. There's also going to be things that are coming up that are new that weren't thought about at the time of the risk assessment. So on a regular basis, once a project and I know specifically with some of the oil and gas companies, they spend twice a year they review their projects that are actually already in maybe construction. Twice a year they go back and review. In these large projects, they may be in construction for 3 years. So any of those things they find could be really significant to drive a completion date. So that was a long answer for that question. Sorry.
All right. Next question that came in is, do you see poorly built schedules being the result of inexperience, the contractor, or could it be the owner's fault?
Yes. So I do see inexperience come into play. What I see in the industry a lot right now is there are folks that have been sent to P6 training class, and they go to the 3-day class. They may even go to the 2-day advanced class after that, and then they're thrown right into the mix to build a schedule. And they may be the only scheduler on the project. So without experience or a mentor, I had the luxury of having a couple when I started. So that is potential. The inexperience, the contractor also does or could do similar things as far as scheduling. They may have priorities different in their portfolio of projects, such that maybe the more inexperienced guy gets the earlier project to build the plan. And then the owner, obviously, the expectations that the owner puts out sometimes drives the contractor to build a certain level of schedule that may be completely different than what they really wanted. They didn't spell out exactly what they wanted early enough. So yes, all three of those.
All right. We had one last question that was submitted. In one of your slides, you had mentioned tool sets to help improve analyzing a schedule, i.e. Acumen, PRA, schedule check, etc. What would be your go-to tool to help analyze schedules to a higher level?
So my go-to, and I'll honestly say my answer is because I'm most comfortable, because I've used it more than the other tools, is Acumen Fuse. I've actually used it since right before it actually came out, and so I've used it consistently for all that time. I actually helped develop some of the metrics that are in the tool now. I am most comfortable with that. I'm becoming more comfortable with it. I teach the tool now, so having the software and having the training tools helps me out as well. But I'm most comfortable. I think it does a good job of being able to, so I can take an output and look at each of those characteristics in the schedule. I can actually build a report, PDF or Word document, and then I can send that document off to the client or the contractor, depending on whose schedule it is, and say, here's what I found. These things need to be fixed. And I can do that pretty quickly.
Great. All right, Daryl, if you want to skip to the next slide for upcoming events. A couple upcoming events, in case you aren't aware of them. Next week is going to be the Region 5 Symposium down in Woodlands, Texas. This is going to be for Region 5 of AACE. Looks to be like it's going to be a good turnout. You have the CPM Conference in 2017, January 10th to the 13th down in Orlando, Florida. And then Western Winter Workshop, another AACE event being put on by the Northern California, Southern California section up in Indian Wells on March 2nd through the 5th. Also, if you are not receiving our newsletter, you can sign up for our newsletter at our website, drmcnady.com. You can go to and look for the loop. It gives you the most up-to-date information on softwares, events, upcoming webinars, new releases of software. So if you're interested and you don't receive our newsletter, you can always sign up for it. We want to thank everybody for taking the time out of their day to attend our webinar. We are actually doing another webinar next month. It's going to be a Primavera P6 user group forum. We're going to let our clients and colleagues be the presenters and submit their questions directly to us. If you got any problems, questions, issues with P6, submit them directly to us. We're going to try and answer them as much as possible. You can find that either on our website or in our newsletter. Again, we want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule today to attend. And we hope everybody has a good rest of their day.